Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Hidden Hockey Podcast. Again, my name is Matt Gordon. If you've not been on here before, please do yourself a favor. Please subscribe to the channel. We're going to go over a lot of different things today. Starting off with the World Junior A Challenge that just was completed in Camrose, Alberta. I'm going to talk a little bit about the standouts of the tournament. Talk about Canada East and West, along with Sweden and the U.S. Get into some of the issues with the tournament and how I think it could be improved. And then we'll go into a recap of the Division 1A under 20s and the Division 3B under 20s, two drastically different divisions. They're going to talk a lot more about differences in skill level, differences in the countries and the quality of the countries, and what their progress has been. And then finally dip into the World Junior Championships and get into a preview of each and every team by team, going over who the top prospects are, who the most skilled players are, and going from there. So I'm going to give it a few more minutes. If you have any questions, obviously feel free to leave them in the chat, but I'm going to start here in a little bit just to get a general idea of what kind of audience we're going to get tonight. So again, thank you so much for those that have come on to the channel. If you're watching this on recording, thank you for joining on. Obviously, if you have any questions, you can also leave those, after the live stream as well in the chat. And then if there's any other things you guys want to talk about on the side, feel free to do so. Leave it in the chat and I'll answer them through the live stream when I can. So let's go ahead and get started here. So we're going to go ahead and talk about the World Junior A the World Junior A Challenge that happened in Camrose, Alberta this weekend. Starting off, 4 teams, obviously, that were in the tournament: Canada East, Canada West, Sweden, and the U.S. It's been interesting to see what the different things have gone on in this tournament. Sorry, one sec. The stream is being weird. Here we go. All right, perfect. So obviously, this was taking place this week. Recapping the different things that were on here. So into the tournament, you can see here. Broken up into 4 different teams. Canada East and Canada West were broken up of non-AJHL, non-BCHL teams that were in the tournament. So this includes the CCHL, the OJHL, and any other minor leagues that were behind that in both the East and West Coast, and they were separated by coast. So obviously that's going to lead to lesser quality, and obviously those teams did not result in very good results here. Canada East beat Canada West. Looked like they were a little bit more competitive than the Western Conference teams, but we'll go into who those players were that were interesting and go into where I see those things going. So a challenge with the tournament is often that there is usually a lot of people that believe that these players shouldn't really be brought into 2 different teams for Canada. It should all be just the best Canadian kids playing in the Junior A loop, and just put them all together and make an all-star team, and that would be a much more competitive tournament, which I would actually agree with. So we'll see, what comes out of the future of the tournament. But I think there's a lot of improvement that can be done within the tournament to help allow it to be better going forward and have it more competitive for the Canadian team. So we'll go into Canada East here. I'm going to share my screen. And going into their roster, a couple of players that I really had my eyes on were Noah Tegelar, who is late 06 born, eligible for this year's draft. Has a C grade according to Central Scouting. This is a big goaltender, 6'4" and about $185. He's probably closer to like 200 now. Playing for the Collingwood Blues in the OJHL. Getting regular starts and has been really dominant at the OJHL level. One would argue one of the best goalies in that league by far. So going into the tournament, there's a lot expected of him. He ended up being the starter of Canada East, and due to the quality of the team he had around him, really got shelled. So obviously going into the tournament, there was a lot of wondering if he would have some draft stock out of this. I'm of the belief, having seen a little bit of the play, that Noah is a little bit below what you would consider to be a draft eligible. I think, Noah's going to be a very, very talented kid in the future. I just don't see NHL pedigree out of him. More than likely, he's going to go and play the Division I level, probably in the lower end of Division I, playing for, maybe some of the newer teams that are emerging within Division I. And obviously, we have yet to see what develops out of that based on the new NCAA and CHL ability to cross within one's league. So the quality is going to, drop a little bit. So I can see him landing in either there or being a really high-end D3 goaltender. So it just depends ultimately on what happens with that. Defensively, they have a bunch of OJHL kids and, brought along Nolan Turnbull as well. Nobody that was really outstanding out of this group. And then when you look at the forward group, one kid who I really had my eye on was the 07 Sean Kingwell. Had the opportunity to watch a few games of his as well, playing for the Navon Grads in the CCHL. This is a kid who's really talented, very skilled. He had an okay tournament. Again, another kid who I thought might have some, pedigree to maybe land into some NHL draft radars. I think he's more going to fit into the Noah Tegelar style of, maybe being a D1 player, or he might even consider, D3 or U Sports. Again, a kid who's really skilled, good ability, but just didn't really bring it in the tournament in the way that I thought he would. And obviously had to struggle because he played with a weaker team around him, but he was one of the better players, I thought, coming onto that Canada East roster. And overall, looking at their team, just didn't really have a lot of scores. We'll go to their stats here. So everybody can see, led by Brett Arsenault, who's an 05. And then going into just various parts of the roster and going through and looking at different things. Sorry about the dog there. And just looking at the roster, Parker Forland's another guy who was looked at as a potential draftee. We'll see where he goes. Should be interesting to see what kind of player comes out of Parker Forland, but another disappointing performance out of him as well. I don't see any draft eligible kids out of the Canada East roster. And for me, they were kind of the disappointment of the tournament. Going into a team that was also very disappointing, I'm going to share my tab now to the Canada West roster. Canada West had a roster filled with some leftover Western Hockey League kids. Also had some AJHL, some Saskatchewan Junior Hockey League kids as well, and then some Manitoba Junior League hockey kids. Because of the tournament with being in the BCHL, not being part of Hockey Canada's radar anymore, you're looking at a team that had some interesting players on it. Nobody that really stood out to me in terms of a guy who I think is going to be on draft radars, but a lot of these different players are going to fill your lower end D1 or your D3 roster. So I'm going to go ahead and go to the stats here. Again, the kid that I would honestly think is the closest to being on a draft radar would be Ellis Mayette. A kid he's a pretty good player on his own right. I don't see an NHL player out of him, but I do see a kid who could potentially go and be a pro one day. Should be interesting to see where he goes from here. And it's just a team that just was mismatched. There wasn't really much that you could do out of this roster to make it better. You could have invited some overagers, but they still would have had the same issues that they had throughout the tournament as well. So it's just a matter of, just not having a really strong roster. And hopefully that gets improved by allowing, the BCHL teams, allowing even some overagers from these leagues to come into the tournament and make it a little bit more competitive. And maybe even merging that team into just one super all-star team that's the best of the Junior A loop in Canada. Now I'm going to move to the U.S. program here, moving on to their roster. They were a very impressive group. Obviously, I'm going to look here. The goaltending, both USHL goaltenders, led by Cam Hendrickson and Caleb Pyle. They split time during the tournament. Both guys, I think, are interesting pedigrees, guys that will look to potentially even be better players down the line. Let me know if you guys can still hear me on here. It said something. I got a notification saying the audio might have gone down, but let me know if you can hopefully still hear me. Both Minnesota-born kids, both have played international and had international experience. Should be really interesting where they go from here. But both of them had a pretty decent tournament. Looking at their defensive core here, the young kid that's in this group is Jacob Rambach, a big kid at 6'6", 201. Other kids I've gotten viewings on before is John Stout's a kid who I've watched a lot. Drake Murray as well. Both of them really skilled players and guys that you want to look at going forward as being potential NHL pedigree guys. The big player out of this tournament for me was Ben Cavan. Ben Cavan led the tournament scoring at 6 goals. Playing for the Des Moines Buccaneers in the USHL. To me, he's not the fleetest of foot, but my God, is his IQ really strong. I look at, Ben Cavan, I look at him as a first rounder. A player that I look at that looks very similar to him is a guy in Tarek Parashak. I think they're very similar players. He was just drafted by Washington last year. Should be really interesting what he does and where he goes going forward. But I really think he's really up to stock. To me, he's a definite first rounder and a guy who you're going to want to watch going into maybe even next year's World Junior. I think he's got that ability to make that roster next year. And then other guys to really watch. William Zellers is a guy who's a really good player as well. Always brings it every time, and he's got a great scoring ability. Lucas Van Vliet was a guy who had a big tournament along with Luke Osborne. I'm not going to focus as much on the draft eligibles or on the non-draft eligibles, those that are already drafted. I think, they've had their story told. What kind of player they are and what they're going to be. I'll answer questions on projectability if anybody has any, but those are different things. And then one guy I want to have, particular attention paid to, and a guy to watch maybe even in this tournament next year, depending on where he is in the USHL, but Jack Hextall. He's an 08 born player, one of the youngest players in this tournament, 4 games, goal and 2 assists. Definitely a guy you want to look at and say, he's going to find his way in the USHL. He's had a really good USHL season for his rookie year. Has always been dominant at the youth levels. Should be really interesting to watch and see where he goes going forward. A guy who I think could fit and talk himself into the top 45, top 30 talks for the 2026 draft. So that was exciting to see that progression from him. And then finally, we're going to go to Team Sweden. They were a really loaded group. Went undefeated until the final where they lost to the U.S. team. This was a group that I was really excited to watch. They were an under-18 program, so they're all 07s. And then looking through the various players and, what they're able to do, look at their goaltending. Luka Hermstam is a guy who I think to me has really fallen down on my board quite a bit. Started out the year really strong. I thought he was going to be the top goaltending prospect out of this core. I don't really see that anymore. I think, Luka Hermstam is a guy who might have fallen even into the second or third round for me. Just a big kid, a bigger kid at 6'1", but not necessarily this high-end size like his teammate Mons Goose is. Should be really interesting to see where he goes going forward on, for Skellefteå. He just moved off after Skellefteå. He's playing for Luleå now, I believe. And third program now in 4 years. Obviously a really projectable kid in terms of he's really good in terms of his mobility, really good in terms of his overall framework and positioning. But there's still some learning to be done. I don't think he's as consistent as you would like him to be. And I think because of that, he is going to drop on some boards, and I can see him maybe going in the 3rd or 4th round now. Mons Goose really improved his profile. I think he's likely to get a look here at the under-18 in April. I think he will probably be the starter for the under-18s for Sweden. Should be really interesting to see where his game grows and how he develops. And then going into the defensive core, this is probably where they lost, honestly, is their defensive core for this tournament was actually not that strong. The 07 group is not really known to have a ton of really great defensive prospects. And if they did, of the few that they do have, they were not slated to come to this tournament. So they were stuck with a B crop of defensemen that really didn't bring it all the way there. The leading scorer in the tournament was Ivar Stenberg, playing for Frölunda right now. Obviously, that Stenberg family has done a lot of different prospects between Otto being drafted, Ivar being, the next one up, and then there's another one in Newt Stenberg, younger kid who's a 2009 born. Should be really interesting to see where people will rank Stenberg. I still have Stenberg not being a first-round pick. I just don't know that the skill projects as well. He's a really good player. Obviously, he's been proven it pretty well at the international level, but I just didn't love his overall game. Another guy I want to talk about is Theos Doxelius. Again, another guy plays for Jer Gardens at the under 20 level and at the under 18 level as well. This is a guy who, to me, I really had a lot of expectation going into the tournament for him. Didn't really love his play. I thought he was a little bit timid at times. I thought he really could have taken more opportunities for himself, really could have made himself a lot more dominant. This was a level that he should have proven that he could play really well in, and I thought he disappointed quite a bit. He only had 2 points in 5 games. I originally had him in my first round. I have him probably now being more of a late second. Going into some more players that really impressed, a guy who is, again, just staying steady on my radar. I'm having a lot higher than most people is Victor Klingsell. Again, from Skellefteå. He's playing at the under 20 level in Skellefteå, averaging about a point per game. Internationally, he's been phenomenal this year. Had an awesome Ivan Holenka, led the tournament scoring, and came in and almost led the tournament scoring at the World Junior A Challenge as well. Considered undersized, but I think he's closer to 5'11". I think, there's a really projectable player in Victor Klingsell, a guy you definitely want to watch for. I think he's got first round written all over him, in all honesty. I think he's super creative with the puck. I think he's got great skill, a great shot, not afraid to go, outside of the perimeter. He doesn't float and sit and wait for the opportunity. He creates it himself. A lot to like with Victor Klingsell, a guy who I think is going to really jump going forward and going into the rest of the year. Another guy who I thought really impressed as well and really shot at my ranks was Jakob E. Wozniak, the Swede. He's a Swede Australian dual national. This is a kid who was really impressive, a good player, good overall skill set for him. Again, another guy with a great shot, good offensive awareness. His defensive ability leaves a little bit more to be desired, but he's a big frame at 6'3" and about 190 pounds. I would expect him to be a really talented player going forward here for Sweden. Might even get himself some looks at the under 20 level. Should be really interesting to see what he goes from here. Another disappointing player for me was Anton Frundell. 4 points in 5 games here at the World Junior A Championships. This is a kid I had at 2 going into the year. I might even have him now outside my top 10 the next time I have a mock. I just, the injuries have been a lot for him. He's had 3 different injuries so far this year. Has not really dominated at the pro level. Now is all of a sudden not dominating at the junior level when he previously dominated. I'm getting a lot of Atu Rati vibes off of, similar progression in terms of development. I think Frundell is finding himself dropping down boards because of the uncertainty around him. And he's just had a murderous row of things going wrong for him in his draft year. It's a shame for him because they really like the player. I think he's a very gifted player. Just has to find a way to get healthy and find himself in the right place. And then another guy who I thought he had a good tournament, not a great tournament, is Arvid Drott. I've had him in my first round. I still didn't feel like he couldn't be in the first round, in my opinion. He, to me, probably could be anywhere from 20 to 50. Really just a talented player, gets in your face, really demonstrative, good play, good overall skill, good ability. Just manages his game super well, and it should be interesting to see where he goes from here. With the rest of his tournaments and where he goes going forward. He'll obviously be a very important piece of the under 18s this year. Should his team not be, too far in the playoffs. But it was very curious. And obviously this tournament brought a lot of different things, with Canada obviously being the winner here. Not Canada, the U.S. being the winner here, beating Sweden in the final. So with that now, I'm going to move now into a couple of different previews of, the past, recaps of the last 2 international tournaments. So we'll go into the D1A under 20s level. There's a lot of really intriguing talent at this level going through each of the teams. Obviously, you can see the leading scorers there. Denmark won the promotion very slightly over Austria. beating them for that spot in the next year's World Juniors. Denmark they have actually a pretty old roster for this tournament. So their 06 and 07 group that's going to lead for next year may not be super strong. They were carried a lot by their 05s. You got a few 07s and 06s in here, including, the main leader being, Tristan Lee Peterson. They're going to lose Molgard next year. They're going to lose a few different players. Cruz Thompson had a big tournament, as you can see here, along with Albert Skulden. Both guys that are intriguing pros. I don't know if they'll necessarily hit the NHL level, but guys that are impressive. Anton Lind had a lot of hype going a couple of years ago. His play has since dropped off. Mads Clivo, as well as another guy who his hype has dropped off considerably. This is going to be an interesting roster next year. I don't know that there's super amazing players coming back. Obviously, you see there's no goaltenders that would be returning. Out of that defensive core, there isn't really a superstar out of that defensive core. And then looking at the forward group, you got Clivo, you got, Thompson's obviously leaving. You got Anton Lind will be in his last year of eligibility. Peterson will be in his last year of eligibility, but they're not returning a lot of players. So I think they're going to really struggle at the World Juniors next year. It should be really interesting to see where they go from here. Now going into exiting out of my screen now, and I'm looking to share my screen for the Austrian team here. The Austrian team had a little bit more firepower. They had one defenseman that was drafted in Gregor Bieber, playing in the Swedish Hockey League for Rogla. And then, Vasily Zelinov was drafted by Buffalo out of the Alps Hockey League. Looking at the goaltending, Oshkan led this group and was a very talented goaltender. One would argue probably the goaltender of the tournament. Oshkan isn't somebody who would be a draft eligible guy. He just is a really dominant player for this level. Won't be on NHL radars, but will definitely be a really solid European goalie for years to come. Looking at their defensive core, you look at Gregor Bieber. He kind of led this group, made it a really talented group, and they found their way to limit a lot of goals. They were a bigger defensive core. He came in and was very physical. Didn't necessarily lead on the score sheet, but he was a really talented player in his own right, and there was a lot to like there. And then the strength of this team, honestly, is in its offensive grouping. The 05 group that they only brought a few. The lead guy being Ian Scherzer, the assistant captain of this group. He's been through this tournament now 2 or 3 times. Ian's a really good player in his own right, somebody who definitely will find himself on some NCAA radars, and will probably play at the D1 level if he continues to follow the path that the USHL allows him to. The 06s being in Vasily Zelinov, a really talented player, as well as Johannes Newman. Really like both of them. They're both really talented. The 07s, Leon Kolarek is a guy in 2026. He's a late-born 07. You're looking at Leon to be a definite first-rounder, in my opinion. I look at him, and I see a lot of Marco Kasper, a lot of tenacity, a lot of good forechecking, very creative offensively. I think even more so than Kasper. A guy to really, really watch out for coming into the tournament. And then the late-born 2009 triple underager in Paul Shinitschig had a really good tournament. 2 points in 5 games for a triple underager is pretty amazing. Very cool to see that he was able to make an impact at this level. Obviously, there's somebody that you're going to look at, and I think he's another guy who has some first-round capabilities and qualities. It should be really fun to watch and follow him going forward. But he was clearly the youngest player in this tournament. Just a super impressive player in his own right. And he brought a lot of good things out there. So it was curious to see, what kind of different play he brought here. And, it's a shame they didn't get promoted. I thought they were a really quality group. I think they had more projectability than Denmark did to really be successful at the World Juniors for next year. But they're going to come in and be a really dominant team at this 1A level, and I think they're going to be very close to finding themselves back in the position where they were at this year. Now we're going to go to Norway here. Norway has a few different players on their roster. Obviously led by two different people. We had Stian Solberg on the defense, and then we had Brandtzæg Nygaard on their forward group, and both of them being 05s. Both of them are not going to return this year. Very surprising that they weren't more of a factor during the tournament. Both of them only had 1 point. I thought Brandtzæg Nygaard and Stian Solberg were both very disappointing in this tournament. Should have had a lot more to their game. This, for being NHL first rounders, they should have come into this 1A tournament and dominated, and they didn't do well at all. So that's very curious in terms of why that is the case. I watched a few clips to see. I didn't love Stian wasn't really – it felt like he didn't want to be at that level. He felt like he was almost forced to go to the tournament, in my opinion. And with Brandtzæg Nygaard, I just think he just didn't – he had no cohesion with his teammates. Didn't really come on a lot of radars until recently, so I think the cohesion didn't help. I think he played not very well at all. I thought the work ethic was there, and that was important. But his skill and his ability and his opportunities to go and be a really good hockey player and play at these really high-end levels and then come to the D1A level and only get 1 goal doesn't really speak well for your offensive upside, in my opinion. I just really was not impressed by him. And actually, I was even more impressed by the younger players on this roster. So looking at some different players on this roster, first and foremost, Nicholas Olsson is a guy who, like Leon Kolarek, is a 2026 eligible. This kid is an absolute superstar. Love this kid's game. Going to be a very talented player. He's got a younger brother, William, who's an 09 born, who's just as impressive. Another late born, I believe, 09, so he's a 2028 draft eligible. A ton of room to talk about for those guys. Olsson is already leading the under-20 grouping in Sweden. Is the top 08 in the entire group, including those that are Swedish. I got a lot of time for him. He's very projectable, a great skater, super creative. A lot to like there with Nicholas Olsson, a guy who I'm going to talk a lot about probably coming into the under-18s as well as the next few tournaments here. Sorry for that move on the screen there. A guy who I thought should have been drafted last year in Elias Strome-Vatne. Again, another skilled player, good potential, good ability. Really like his overall skill set and the way he play makes. I think he's a super talented player. He brings a lot to the table, and a lot to like with him and his ability going forward into this. He's obviously going to be a really dominant player in this tournament. Somebody you want to really go out and watch for. Sorry, guys, my charger needs to be plugged in. But a lot to like with him and his ability as well. So going into some other players to watch as well. Michael Eriksson is a guy who is a draft eligible this year. I have him just outside my first round going into this year's draft. I don't know that he'll get drafted that high, but he's definitely going to be a mid-round pick. Another player playing for Farjestad who seems to be kind of the factor here now for Norwegian players that are really talented. Should be really interesting to watch his progression going forward. Another really projectable hockey player, and a lot to like coming out of Norway. I think there's just a ton of really good, talented players coming out of Norway. Looking at their roster, they're going to return a lot of these kids next year. You got a goalie returning next year. You got Ludwig Lofton, who's a defenseman. I didn't really talk about much, but he was an important factor this year. Andreas Svierson Pedersen is an 07 born. He'll come back next year. You got two kids that are very important defensemen that will come back here for Norway. Obviously, you're going to have Aram Olsen. You're going to have Matthias Daly. You're going to have Michael Eriksson. You're going to have Strome Vatne will come back for the under-20 grouping next year as well. Just a lot to like. And Luke Koblar as well, the 07 born. I didn't really talk a lot about him, but I like his game a lot as well. To me, if they could have a really strong roster next year and bring even more 08s and really strong 07s to their group, They look like sneaky favorites to win the D1A and come up and play with the big boys. I think there's a ton of great players out of this Norwegian group, and there's a lot to like with them. Honestly, I think there's just a ton of potential and a ton of really good skill, and I'm looking forward to watching them going into next year's tournament. Now we move on to Slovenia here. Slovenia has they were another similar roster to Norway, right? Really good players. Goaltending was a little bit weaker, but you had Jan Golisic was a really important player for them, along with Tit Smolnikar. A lot to like out of those two very gifted offensive players, along with Rock Frazier. And then, looking at their forward group, Mike Krunkic is a very important player for them. Konabel is a really good player as well. Mamutovic. He's Polish and Slovenian, or sorry, not Polish, Czech and Slovenian. He's dual national. I like Mark Siever as well, was very important for them, and Philip Sitar, both guys that were really important players in this tournament for Slovenia. And then looking obviously at the roster, like I said, Philip Sitar and Mark Siever. Mark Siever is playing at the pro level right now. He is draft eligible. Even though he's an 05, he's a double overager. To me, he definitely needs to be picked this year. I will be shocked if he's not. I will be shocked if he's not at least signed. Already playing at a level that's pretty impressive for a kid who's an 05. Should be really interesting to watch and see where he goes in his game and what he does going forward. Was obviously really talented at this level. Somebody who you really like going forward into this tournament, and I really like what his overall game had here. Sitar is obviously playing at the NCAA level, has really improved himself as well, along with Golisic playing really well. You look in the usual suspects played really well in this tournament for them. And, the only guys that really disappointed were Petrovonic, Lepsa, Plamelj wasn't really that impressive, and Konabel could have done more. Obviously, none of those guys got points. Tit Smolnikar could have done a little bit more as well, but you look at the grouping that's done here, and I thought Slovenia did a really nice job with the talent they had. A lot to like, going forward for the Slovenian group. Obviously, they're a really small country, so the fact that they've even extracted these players the way I have is really impressive. Golisic can come back next year. Plamelj can come back next year. Lepsa can come back next year. They're going to have some groups. They're losing a lot of 05s. They had a really strong 05 class, but I think their 07 class and their younger groupings are going to really prove to be very impressive in this grouping and find their way going forward here. So we're going to move now to France. France was a bit of a disappointment. They had nobody that was really draft eligible. They're not as dominant as they probably would have been normally. But looking at their grouping here, you can look and see at their roster. Theo Bassinier and Arthur Devalle were two guys that were really impressive. Looking at Nogaredo and Sansa Kitala, the dual nat that's French and Belgian. Devalle has played at really high end levels. Came back to France just to see what was going. To go and play back at the French level. Bassinier is the guy who I thought really kind of came out in this tournament. He's kind of the big show me player out of this tournament. Really impressive to see what, the different things he could do and what he had going forward. I really liked his, the fact that a defenseman leads this team in scoring was really interesting. Mathis Dufour was the guy who I expected to do a little bit more, considering he was playing for the Brooks Bandits this year, playing on a really dominant team at the BCHL level. It hasn't seemed like he's adjusted as well as one would expect. But that's okay because he's got plenty of time to do so, and he's got another year or two at this level to really go and play well. Goaltending-wise, there wasn't really a ton of great goaltending. Nakash, led the grouping here with a pro roster. They're going to return some players. Paulin Hostin is a young 08 kid. I don't think he's, it's too soon to say whether or not he's got pro potential. I think he needs to come into a different level here. He might be a kid that is a good candidate to go overseas and maybe play in North America once he gets a little bit more projectable, but a guy to really look at. Dufour is going to come back. Dijon's going to come back. Sonsa Kitala is a guy who could come back as well. Not a strong roster next year for France, but they should be competitive. They're going to avoid relegation, in my opinion. It should be really interesting what they do going forward here for the rest of the tournament. And then finally, we're going to go to the team that obviously got relegated to 1B. We're going to go to Hungary. And this Hungarian group really disappointed. It was very surprising. They were a younger group. Goaltending-wise, they didn't really have the strongest goaltending in the world. Defensively, they didn't really have super strong players. You know, your best players were your young players, honestly. One guy in particular would be Zin, playing at the under-18 level in Sweden. And then you have another guy that was really talented in Betons Bessanier. One of the younger groupings that Hungary had. So obviously they're both going to come in the next year at the 1B level, find themselves in a little bit more of a comfortable level for those two. It should be really interesting where they go going forward. And then the group here, a really dominated group with the 05s. The 06s were not super strong. You were really led, honestly, by your 208s. These kids are both really talented players in Agustin Schmidt and Damon Christophe Schwongoff. Both of them are really impressive players playing at the Finnish level. Schwongoff has gotten some pro time at the Liga level. He had 2 points this year. Looking at, Bessanier obviously needed a little bit of an adjustment along with Agustin Schmidt. But there was some really interesting play out of these younger kids. They're going to go at the 1B level now and find their opportunities and see what they can do going forward. Overall, though, a really interesting crop of players in this 1A level. Some definite projectability and guys who I think could really show themselves here for future draft prospects and different things like that. So it was really curious to see what they were able to do going forward for the rest of this tournament here. So I'm going to stop sharing here, and we'll go ahead and preview the 3B tournament now, or recap the 3B tournament now. I'll go ahead and share my screen there. Let me share it real quick. So now we're going to the World Junior 3Bs. Going into this, obviously this is a different level than the 1A level. The 3B level, these are a lot of emerging programs. You look and see here, you got Thailand, you got Kyrgyzstan, South Africa, and Luxembourg. The real impressive thing out of this tournament, honestly, is a few players I just want to talk about briefly. I'm not going to get too in-depth with this. I might do a future video in terms of each of these prospects and where they're – not prospects, sorry. Each of these players and where these programs are headed. But two guys who I wanted to point out in particular. One guy is Alikan Ali Askarov. To be an 09, this is a 15-year-old kid playing for Kyrgyzstan. Had his first real big games here at the D3 level. Had 6 points in 3 games. A lot of his teammates in this tournament that scored less have been playing for Russia in various leagues. This is a kid who I think is a real good candidate to move into, maybe the Russian under 16, leagues, somewhere in that range, or maybe even come to North America and really learn the game there. You had a really young roster. The 09s are really talented on this group. Obviously, the first guy who I really looked at from Kyrgyzstan and thought he had some, serious potential was Sultan Ismanov, who was an 04 born who couldn't play in this year. Had his last year. But they're growing a lot of really good kids out of Kyrgyzstan. This is a very emerging market in hockey. Are there any NHL kids out of this group? Really hard to say. I would say no out of all these kids right now. But the projectability is really impressive. And if they continue their development path, you could see some of these kids land in the pro ranks somewhere. Just depends on where they go, how much they want to put into their game, and their work ethic there. I really was impressed, though, by Kyrgyzstan and their group. They're a younger program. They went and beat South Africa, which is an established group, then lost to Thailand, who eventually won the tournament, and then they beat Luxembourg. So they went and they showed themselves pretty well. And then obviously looking at the Thai roster, they have their own pro league. A lot of people don't know that. One kid in particular I wanted to point out was Tanat Limpan-Yakal. This is a kid who, again, a late-born kid. Lots to like with this kid. I caught some clips of this kid. He was super fast, good ability, good skill. Obviously, being 17 and 5'11" is a bit of a, maybe not the best thing for him. But two guys I really just wanted to point out. I don't know if they necessarily have pro-level ability, but they were really impressive compared to the other, players within this tournament. Two of my main standouts, honestly, and should be really interesting to see, where Thai hockey goes. They've never had a kid, make a pro level anywhere outside of, a couple kids in Masato Kitayama went a couple places. Ken Keenborn went to a couple different places as well. Those two obviously have gone and played in Denmark and played in lower levels of Finland and Sweden and different things like that. But I think the Thai hockey development is really kind of going on the up here. And, with some expats that might come over to Canada and continue to develop some of these kids, it should be really interesting where some of these kids go going forward. They even have a couple kids right now that are in North America, which is really impressive. They weren't on this roster, probably because of travel reasons, but a lot to like with them. And then going on to now the final part of this preview here, we're going to go into what everybody's probably been waiting for is the World Junior preview. So now I'm going to go into the World Junior rosters, and we'll talk about each and every one of them going into this here. So let's go into some players to watch out of this grouping. So we'll look at the usual suspects. We'll look at Team Canada first, and then I'll go to Czechia, I'll go to Germany, and I'll just go in this order right here. So going into the under-20s here, Canada has got a major league roster here. They got three kids in Carson Bjarnason, Carter George, and Jack Ivankovic. All three of these kids are very, very projectable at the pro level. I'm personally very high on Ivankovic. I have him as a first-rounder going into this year's draft. The only kid who I think is possible to even get in the first round from a goaltending perspective, in my opinion. Just really like his character, like the fight he has. Yeah, he might be 5'11". I think he plays bigger than that. A lot to like with him and his overall skill set. Carter George has obviously proven himself at the OHL level, and Bjarnason is probably Bjarnason will likely be the starter of the group, with Carter George getting a couple of starts into this group as well. Looking into this, the rest of this roster here, obviously you have, really talented players in 05s. Oliver Bonk is a guy to look at. Andrew Gibson. A bit of a surprise with Sawyer Maminio to make the roster. Obviously, I liked his ability and what he could bring to the table. Tanner Mollendijk was a guy to look at. Sam Dickinson is Sam Dickinson. Obviously, from a draft perspective, Matthew Schaefer is a guy who a lot of people – I'm excited to get some viewings on him because I never really got a solid viewing on him. The clips I've seen of him I really like. I think there's a real projectability to him, and I think he could be a guy who I don't have him in my rank right now just due to limited viewing, but I think he could easily land in my first round, if not be in my top probably 10 even, just based on the projectability, the unbelievable skating he possesses, and the way he can break out pucks. He's super impressive, and he can do this at the World Junior level. He's going to prove a lot of people. Prove to a lot of people that he is capable of being a top 5, top 10 pick in this 25 draft. Looking at the forward group here, Easton Cowan, he's coming into this tournament with a 56-point game point streak at the OHL level, which is just unheard of. And Tanner Howe is a kid who's going to be leaned upon. Bradley Nadeau, coming down from the AHL level, it's really awesome. He's able to come in and impact this tournament. You look at Braden Yeager, Callum Ritchie, Ray Koff. Obviously the 06s. You look at Catton, Baudouin. It's going to be a really great checker for this group. Porter Martone is going to be, a guy who's going to put himself either into the top 5 conversation, maybe even the top 3, depending on who really likes him. I think he's going to have a big opportunity in this tournament. And then obviously the really big phenom in Gavin McKenna With a roster that's so talented, he's getting looked at with fourth line minutes right now, which is pretty surprising. But Gavin is a guy who is clearing away the number 1 overall pick in 2026. I don't think it's even close. I don't think it ever will be close. He'll be unanimous in my opinion. Just a super phenomenal player. A guy who I think by the end of the tournament will be one of the more important factors for Team Canada. This grouping to me is a gold level. It's a gold medal roster. I think they're really, really super impressive, very talented. Just a lot of depth all across the board. One of the better rosters I've seen them come into the World Juniors with, and I think they're going to really show everybody what they are, and that's going to be a really important team and a great champion. Sorry, I just had to get a sip of water there. Now we'll go to Czechia. Czechia has gone and they're going in here with this really good roster. They have the big guy in Michael Hrabal. Obviously got goaltending. That's going to be really impressive there. I think this is a really important tournament for Michael Hrabal to really prove that he's a high-end goaltender. Adam Jiricek's going to get an opportunity here along with Thomas Galvis to lead this group. And Galvis might find himself the opportunity to get drafted finally. He was a guy who was if you'd seen my videos from last year, he was a guy who I felt should have been drafted. Didn't have him really high on my personal rank, but I knew he was a good player in his own right and should have been at least considered for the draft. And then going into this lower grouping here, there's a couple of sevens, which is interesting. Adam Zhidlicki is a guy who might find himself on some draft radars. Adam Novotny is a guy who is a definite first rounder for 2026, a late born 07. They have a little bit of a weaker group with this group. They're bigger kids, but there's not really a physical element to many of these kids, so it's going to be interesting to see what they're doing. They might be forced to the perimeter a lot. So it really depends on the type of players that come into this tournament, what they're able to do. Czech, to me, this is a grouping that looks like it could be like 5th or 6th. I don't really see like super high-end growth out of this group. I think they're likely going to fall to 6th or 7th. I wish I could say more, but I don't think the skill is really there for them. And I think there's going to be some teams that surprise a little bit later in the tournament here. So now we'll move on to Germany. Germany's grouping is interesting. There's a few different players here to look at. Goaltending-wise, they don't really have a super strong player. Pertuch is probably going to be the starter, with AR being the backup. Defensively, you got Panocha, you got Trotman, will be very important players. Paul Mayer is a guy to look at. They have the big kid in Rael Kaiser, who 6'7", 207. Might be really looked at, maybe even similar to, like a Boris Volobik kind of player. He could be in that kind of framing. He's not a super offensive player, but he's a guy with a bit of a mean streak, and he's got a really great range to him. It should be really interesting to see what he does going into the rest of this tournament. And then obviously Carlos Handel is a guy who has a lot of upside. The Germans really feel highly about him. This is a big breakout tournament for him, and I think if he can find his way in this tournament, he might be able to find himself fitting into the mid rounds here and maybe finding himself drafted before all is said and done. And then you go to their forward groupings here. Some guys to look at out of this group would be Julius Sumpf would be a guy playing in the QMJHL this year. As far as the 06s go, Elias Puel playing at the DEL level is an interesting player in his own right. 07s, Lewandowski, Kosa, Max Schaefer as well. Again, you don't have a Stutzla-like talent. You don't have a Sider-like talent on this grouping. I don't expect major results out of this group. I think there's still a lot of different kinks and things that have to be worked out of this group. So it should be really interesting to see where they go going forward for the rest of the tournament. I think Germany is a grouping that's going to fit probably closer to like 8th or 9th. We'll be very curious to see what happens going forward for us in the tournament for them. Moving on now to Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan is a team that, again, similar to Germany, doesn't really have a ton of projectability, but they have a really good starter in Vladimir Nikitin. Vladimir Nikitin, I think, is going to be able to really handle himself. He's a guy who's used to high volume shots. He's a big kid at 6'5", 201. There's a lot to like with him and his ability and his skill set. You got a lot of MHL kids that have gone on and probably playing for Baris Astana, or they're probably playing for Usk-Komnogorsk. Should be really interesting to see where those guys go and develop. The 05s that are in this tournament as well. You have Alexander Kim as a guy to really look at, like Lyapunov, Davlet Nurkanov, who plays at the Finnish level, was former teammates with Alexander Kim as well. Sarkinov is an 06 born who's going to lead that grouping along with Abzal Alibek. This is a group who, again, unfortunately, I don't think they have the star power to really dominate in this group. I think they're going to fight for relegation. There really isn't just that playmaker that's going to really dominate and play well for them. They were really impressive, obviously, at the 1A level, which led to their promotion. But it's very curious to see where they go from here. I think they're going to really struggle against the Canadas. You're going to see some 8-1s, some 10-1s, some 12-1s. The U.S. team is going to be really talented as well. I think they're going to fight. Sweden and Finland could really do an opportunity on these groupings. So I think this is a team that's going to fight for relegation. They're going to probably likely fight with the Germanys, the Latvias. They're going to really fight for their spot, and they may end up being the relegated team out of the group. Now moving on to Latvia. Latvia has some interesting players in their own right. They have Leonard Felbergs is playing in the QMJHL right now. Then you look at, there's a couple other QMJHL prospects. Oljanskis is a guy who was drafted last year in the draft, playing in the Swedish under-20 level. They have some 07s as well in the grouping. And then they have a really young forward core. The really exciting part of this group is there's a ton of really high-end skill and potential out of this group. There's not really a ton of great players out of the 05s. The one guy, obviously, that everybody wants to talk about is Eric Smateko, the 6'6" kid. 6'6", probably closer to like 215, 220 now. Really good skill, good ability. Has played at the QMJHL level for a couple of years now, so he's going to be thought upon as a leader for this group. Looking into the 06s, Bruno Osmanis is a guy who I had on my draft radar. He's fallen off a little bit for me. He hasn't really been dominant at the pro level. You look at some 07s. You got Carlos Fugans is playing for Flint, the OHL level, and then you have Daniel Serkins, who's a guy who is finding himself on a lot of draft radars despite playing in the Swiss under-20 league. Should be really interesting to see what his growth is and what he can do. Playing for SC Bern at the under-20 level, he'll find himself some pro games, and I personally have him ranked on my draft board. I think he's a guy who will go in the later rounds. And then the real strong group that's in this is their 08 group. Berzalkins is a guy who he struggled at the USH level, but he's a young kid at 16. Has been really dominant in North American, youth hockey. It's really impressive to watch him grow. Martins Klokons has been really good at the NAHL level, been one of the better players as a 16-year-old. Should be really interesting to watch him grow. Oliver Morniks is a guy who is going to get drafted. And then the big guy who is the most intriguing guy, I think, out of the 08 group is Roberts Nodines, playing at the prep level for Shattuck St. Mary, which is very rare for international kids to make the prep team. And then to be an 08 and be the youngest player on the prep team and play as well as he has been super impressive. This kid's already 6'6" at 16 years old. Could grow to even 6'7", 6'8", but if you're imagining the skill, you're imagining the ability and the potential. This Latvian team has very, very intriguing players, and there's a lot of upset quality to them. Should be really interesting to see what they're able to do for the rest of this tournament. I am going to root like hell for them. I love the Latvian fans. I love the passion they have. Should be really awesome to see where they go from here and what kind of players come out of this group. But Latvia is the team to watch in this group. Mark my words. I think they're going to scare some teams in this tournament just based on their sheer will, their determination, and then the young grouping of players they have along with the skill they have. Now we move on to Slovakia. Slovakia, they're going to have a couple players here. They're going to probably split between the three, in my opinion, but they have a young goaltending group, which is good to see. The 07 group, obviously, Radojevic is going to be a big leader for this group along with Sturbach. Both of them are really going to lead this group along with Kromach. There's just a ton of depth there. And then going under the forward group, you got Jan Chauvin, one of the really talented 07s, along with Tobias Tomic. Miroslav Shatan is going to play in this tournament as well. Pekarčić has been here multiple times. It's been a really important group for them. For the Slovaks, obviously, they're not going to be the level of the Nemec, the Slavkovskis, the Dvorskis. They don't have these guys in the tournament this year. They're going to find themselves probably battling with the Switzerlands of the world. They're probably going to be in the 5th to 6th place range, probably fighting with the Czechs as well. They're just trying to find their game and their ability. We'll see whatever happens with them. That's as far as that group goes. They're not super sexy. They're not very exciting. They're just going to find their way through this tournament. And the Slovak group, I think, that's going to really impress is going to be the 08s, the 09s, and the 2010 group. That's the group to really watch. And I would consider their next golden generation in Slovakia. Should be really interesting to see those players grow and develop going into the next few years. But just they're going to find their way. Their main goal is just to stick at the level, get themselves in a good place to maybe medal. That's where Slovakia will end up. Moving on now to Switzerland. Switzerland, they have Christian Kirsch, who was drafted. Another guy who could be drafted, and Elijah Neuenschwander, playing at the under-20 level, similar to Daniel Sirkins, who we was just talking about with Latvia. And then they have Krzysztof Hue's son, Iwan Hue, who's playing at the Western Hockey League level. Out of this group, I think Hue might be the guy to start, with Kirsch getting some opportunities. And then going into their defensive core, Basil Sonsonens really impressed a lot of people at the under-18 level. Has found his way now to prominence within the prospect world. Ustenkov is a guy who should really be dominant at the the level here. You got about 5 or 6 guys who have all played and had really good experience, either the pro level or had really strong appearances at the under 18s for Switzerland. And then looking at their group here, you got Lars Steiner, who is their younger player in this grouping, but he's going to be a very important counted upon piece, along with Yamiro Reber, Simone Meyer. You're going to have Kimo Gruber's going to have some opportunity, and Leo Briard. But there's just, again, a group that's going to fight with the Slovaks. They're going to be right in that core of the group with the Germanys too. That whole section is a grouping that I think a team like Latvia can spring ahead of those groups. Latvia, like I said, I'm really bullish on the Latvians this year. I think they're a really good grouping out of that. Out of the group of players they have there, I think there is a lot more appeal to them. Switzerland tends to underperform in these tournaments. They have coaching that Marcel Jenny has been coaching for a couple years now. It's really going to come down to what kind of Switzerland are we going to get. Are we going to get the stereotypical standard Switzerland, or are we going to get a grouping that's going to be really impressive? That's going to be determined by their play, their overall skill set, and what they're able to do. Now we'll move on here to Sweden. Sweden, to me, again, it should be another team that really battles here. They don't really have the best goaltending compared to what they normally do, but they're always strong goaltending-wise. Their defensive core leaves a little bit to be desired. You're going to have Axel Sandin Palika, who's going to be a really important counted-upon piece. Theo Lindstein is going to also be a big part of this group as well. But there's not a really strong core out of this group. So that's going to put them in an interesting position. As far as the 05s, 06s, they chose not to take any 07s, which I thought was super interesting. Obviously, you look at the grouping they have here. The 05s aren't super strong out of this group. David Edstrom is a guy who, has some projectability. Otto Stenberg is going to be a very important piece. I was just talking about Ivor earlier. Otto is going to be a very important piece here at the World Juniors for Sweden. Inger Sorum is going to be a guy who obviously was of Norwegian descent, is now playing at the AHL level, and now will play for Sweden along with Anton Wahlberg. And then Victor Eklund is the real draft eligible to watch in this group. Eklund might not find himself as much ice time as he would like, but this is an important tournament for him to kind of learn who he is as a player, find his overall groove and potential and his skill. Should be really curious to see what we're going to see out of Sweden. But I will be honest, I think Sweden will not medal in this tournament. I don't think they're super gifted. I don't think they're a very talented group compared to normal. I would expect them to be in fourth place. I really do. I think there's just a lot of warts that they got to work through, find themselves in, and just grow out of. So there's going to be some opportunity there, and I think there's going to be some serious things you have to think about going forward here with their team. Then we're going to go into the U.S. roster. I'm going to share my tab there for that. For Finland, I'll go by what I think their roster will be. They don't have an official roster out as of right now, but we'll talk about that when we get there. Their goaltending here for the U.S., I think, is the strongest in the tournament. Trey Augustine will be a major factor in this tournament. He's already gone and won a World Junior Gold. He's gone and played. Now this is his third tournament. You're going to have Sam Hillebrand coming in behind him along with Hampton Sukinski. Both guys who can be more than capable at this level. Really good depth and one of the better goaltending tandems we've seen in this tournament in years for the U.S. Then you look at the defensive core here. You're led by Zeev Buyum. You're led by Aram Manishian. You're going to have Logan Hensler is going to be a 2025 draft eligible that will be at the tournament along with Blake Fiddler. Their defensive grouping here isn't super strong in my opinion. I think it's a good group. I don't think it's a great group. And then we look forward to the forwards here. Obviously Trevor Connolly is a guy you're going to look at. Cole Eiserman, Ryan Leonard, and James Higgins are going to be massive impact pieces. This is where the strength of the group is in their forward group. A lot to like with the U.S. forwards. I think they're going to come in. I have them now being the silver medalists out of this group. Should be really good to see what comes out of them. But I really like what this group has. I like Connolly. I like Eiserman. I like Higgins. Higgins is going to be super impactful. I think he's going to cement his opportunity to be a number one overall pick in this tournament. Should be really cool to see what kind of performance we got out of him, and if he puts up a really legendary one, putting up 15, 16, 18 points in this tournament, I think he locks himself up at number one in my opinion. I think there's just no one can touch him at that point. And then Ryan Leonard is going to be one of the more impactful players in this tournament, a guy who you could argue could play at the National Hockey League level right now. Going to get his opportunity to win another World Junior Gold. We'll see what happens there. Oliver Moore, Danny Nelson, Gabe Perreault, Teddy Stiga, all guys that are going to be super impactful players for this group and for the core. Should be really interesting where they go from here as well. And then finally, I'm just going to talk about the Finnish team, at least from last year. Key returnees that are coming back. Costa Helenius will be a guy that will be very impactful and thought about. Emil Hemming will be a guy who will be a very important piece to them as well. Aaron Kiviharju is another guy who's going to be a very impressive player for them as well. I'd say those three are going to be really impactful. I have Finland to me being the bronze team. I think they're going to be a really awesome group to watch. Super talented, good ability. They might have some 05s come in here for the tournament and Benjamin Roteman. You could have some different players that have really ranked high going into next year. It should be really impressive to watch them grow and develop and see where they go from here. But there's a lot to like in this tournament. I think, like I said, I think my projection is Canada gold, U.S. silver, Finland bronze, Sweden with the 4th seed, and then let the groupings fall where they may. I would honestly even put Latvia 5th. I really believe they're that good. They're going to be the team to watch in this tournament, in my opinion, as far as a sleeper goes and an underdog goes. We've gone an hour now. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the preview. For those that have stayed on the whole time, I really appreciate you guys staying on. As always, if you are watching this on recording, you have any questions, you have any feedback, please leave it in the comments below. Please leave it in the chat off to the side. Please, if you really like the content I just put out, please subscribe to the channel. Greatly appreciated. Really appreciate growing this audience, getting it more out there. I'm going to be putting out a lot more videos through this month. Want to get to about 200 to 250 subscribers by the end of the month. We'll see if we can get there. I'd love to. Thanks for following along. I'm going to do another video here that's going to come out probably next week, along with maybe another live stream or two before the new year. And maybe, I'm going to try and pack as much content as I can. So you might see me a lot more often than you normally would. Thank you so much for coming on here. Again, this is on recording, so it'll stay on here. Please follow me on Instagram at Hidden Hockey. Follow me here on YouTube, subscribe, and then also follow me on Twitter as well, or X. I'll be at Hidden Hockey on there as well. And then eventually I might be making a TikTok here in the next couple weeks and putting more draft content out there as well. Stay tuned to all the upcoming content that'll be coming up. I'll be updating everybody on Instagram, on the community tab on YouTube. As always, thanks for watching, and please subscribe, and I'll see you.